Welcome, everyone. We'll be starting in just a few moments as folks join us from the last panel. Thanks so much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for another amazing panel session. It looks like we're ready to get started, so I'm going to stop our screen share and kick it to Kristen Daly to begin. Thanks so much.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our next session at the Goalmakers Forum. Today, this session is something really top of mind for many of us. It's about global development after the election in the United States and how it will shape our future. I am thrilled to have such experienced panelists to share their views today. And we have also thrilled to have Michael Igoe from Devex, who will moderate our session today. I'll turn it over to Michael now to get started. Michael.
Thanks, Kristen, and thank you all so much for being here. I'm really excited to be part of this discussion. As Kristen mentioned, my name is Michael Igoe. I'm a senior reporter with Devex based in the US. We're in the midst of a presidential transition that marks a dramatic shift from a White House that has espoused an America First perspective on international affairs to one that has pledged to recommit to multilateralism and re-engage across a broad range of policy areas, from climate to development to global health. We have a fantastic group of speakers who are going to talk about what that shift might mean for people and organizations working in development at a time when nearly all of our goals and operations are challenged by a global pandemic that is forcing a major, unprecedented rethink about how development happens and what it should strive to achieve. So I'm just going to very briefly introduce our speakers today, and you can find their full bios on the Whova platform, where they're much longer and in much more depth than we can go into today. So first we have Tjada McKenna, who's the CEO of Mercy Corps. Tjada, thanks so much for being here. Clarence Edwards is the Legislative Director for Sustainable Energy and Environment at the Friends Committee on National Legislation. And Dan Glickman is the former Secretary of Agriculture and Senior Advisor to the US Global Leadership Coalition. Thank you all so much. It's great to see you, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts. Just by way of a sort of introduction to get us all on the same basic starting point, could each of you share your perspective on how the Trump administration has transformed foreign aid and US global development engagement? What do you see as the policy and political landscape on these particular issues that the Biden administration is going to be inheriting when it takes office on January 20th? And we will start with Clarence, if you don't mind. Let's hear what you have to say.
Sure, thank you, Michael. Well, I think that the landscape and the environment that the Biden administration is going to inherit is one that has been marked by the phrase you used, America First, and translated into foreign assistance. That meant budget proposals slashing billions, proposing billions of dollars of cuts a year to US aid and to other programs, attempts to rescind funding that had already been appropriated by the Congress, murky foreign assistance reviews that no one quite knew what they were doing, and a hiring freeze. So I think that you have a landscape where foreign assistance has really been in a defensive crouch over the past 4 years or so. But at the same time, this administration surprisingly turned around from wanting to zero out OPIC, and through its support behind US development finance and the BUILD Act. And I credit the leadership of Mark Green and Ray Washburn, USAID and OPIC respectively, who navigated this Game of Thrones-like administration and pushed back against populist headwinds. But I think it's a foreign aid, a foreign assistance environment that is kind of beat up after these past 4 years.
Thank you for that. Secretary Glickman, let's go to you. You've worked within this architecture for a long time. What do you see as the environment that the Biden administration will inherit?
I guess I would start with nowhere to go but up. That would be my basic perspective. I would agree with Clarence. Great to see Tjada on here. I've worked with her over the years. She's the best. But anyway, look, not everything that came out of Trump was terrible, most in this area, but where there were some good things, it was usually congressionally directed. So U.S. support, for example, for the World Food Program remained strong, in large part because there was great congressional interest, but the administration went along with that. So I can't just cast a giant cloud over everything they did. But the isolationism that took place, the pulling out of not only the Paris climate change, but the World Health Organization, the America First policy, the talk about getting out of NATO, which was really dangerous stuff, given what was happening in the rest of the world. In the hawkish rhetoric, just without trying to shape it to fit the circumstances, was really not good for America. And so I think the America First policy is an America which engages the world. I think we called the Trump policy a wrong policy. It really wasn't America First. In some places, it was America Last, because we were ignored and rejected by a lot of players in the world. So I just think you're going to see, looking at the team that President-elect Biden has appointed so far in the foreign policy space, I think you're going to see a team that's will carry on the traditions of America, frankly, since the Franklin Roosevelt days, and particularly Truman, Eisenhower. You look back to all of our presidents, and they all wanted to see America as a force for good in the world, and not to control the world, but a force for good, an engaged force. And so that would be my perspective.
Fantastic. Thank you, Secretary. Tjada, you have a long history inside USAID, among other places. What's your take on this? Has the agency been fundamentally changed? Has the foreign aid apparatus been fundamentally changed in the last 4 years?
Yeah, no, Clarence and Dan covered some of this really well, but I'll add to that. We see a workforce within a lot of U.S. agencies, and USAID and state and other development agencies were not spared, where we've lost a lot of senior career talent. And the workforce that is left has probably been a bit demoralized and underappreciated, particularly in this last year of the administration. So I think you're going to see a workforce. Some people in the workforce also perceived that they were penalized for having worked closely with the Obama administration, right? So I think the Biden people are going to walk in with a workforce that's a bit traumatized, and also maybe a little bit scared to cooperate as much or to be fully on board with everything. So we will look to see what happens there, and hope that's not the case. I think we're also walking into a situation where a lot of our allies are a little bit shaken by how quickly and unilaterally we could do things like withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement, or say that we're stopping funding to the World Health Organization, even though that never took place. And so I think you'll see, I think the Biden team is very well equipped to kind of say that we're back. But I think people also know that they have to plan for a time when we are not back. The upside of this time with Trump and what we're going to see with the agency now is that that bipartisan consensus on the Hill that that foreign assistance funding is important held up. And despite the Trump administration trying to make cuts year over year, that number remained flat and steady all along. The bad news of that is just that the need for that aid has grown and grown over time as that number has risen steady. So the Biden administration and USAID are going to be chock full of people and great ideas for things that we need to do on climate aid and financing and results-based measurement. But they're also going to find that there may not be as much money for some of those things as they wanted. So I think we're going to have to work with them, and we're going to have to continue to do our part as outside actors, as NGOs and civil society, to make the case to the American people about why this is as important, if not even more important than ever, that we increase our very small share of the budget towards these things.
That's great. Yeah, and I think each of your comments really reflects that this isn't necessarily just flipping on and off a switch. And I want to dig into that in your particular areas of expertise, which are considerable. And Secretary Glickman, let me start with you. You mentioned the World Food Program and sort of some remaining bipartisanship there. The COVID-19 pandemic has been accompanied by really dire warnings about a new wave of famine, new waves of food insecurity around the world. What is the argument that can be made that the United States, at this time in particular, really does have a responsibility to lead on global food security? And in making that argument, what does that leadership look like? If we do see a major transformation in the role that the United States is playing, what does that transformation entail for global food security?
Well, I think the arguments are many. One is, of course, a humanitarian argument, that it's always been the United States that has taken up this challenge of helping to feed a hungry, poor world. We've done it for years. It started during the Second World War and continued on in the Marshall Plan, but it really developed when President Eisenhower first proposed the Food for Peace initiative, and it became a bipartisan effort. Both parties in Congress really led the effort to help feed the world and feed the hungry in a variety of different ways. We're the largest contributor to the World Food Program, but we provide through USAID and USDA and other agencies a great amount of assistance. And I think there's strong bipartisan support, largely supported by the faith-based community and others who see it in our national interest. Second of all, where you have hungry people and there's famine, there's usually, and food insecurity, there's often violence and political insurrection and unrest that takes place. And you see that all over areas that are underserved, whether it's in sub-Saharan Africa, Yemen, other parts of the world which we have problems. So it's in our interest to prevent conflict from happening. And conflict doesn't always take place where there's poverty, but it often does. And that's the great benefit of what we've done, not just provide us food assistance, but in USAID's programs and Feed the Future initiative and a whole assortment of Power Africa and a variety of things. It's been, really significant. And the third thing is other countries are beginning to fill this this role. And there's no secret that the Chinese have taken a much more aggressive involvement in a variety of development efforts around the world. They're not as successful as we are for a lot of different reasons. Their business model of the country is not as good as ours, I would say. Everything they tend to be much more transactional, whereas we tend to be basically wanting to uplift the way people live around the world and improve their lives and build this long-term person-to-person relationship. So I think all those reasons really press us to continue to be engaged in the world. I'm involved with the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, which is an organization encouraging global engagement and offering the reasons that it's in America's national interest, national security interest, military security interest, and a humanitarian interest to do the right thing here. And I think you're going to see us, as I said in my opening statement, I think you're going to see the United States move back more into its norm, the role of being a positive, constructive, helpful player. It doesn't mean that every part of our U.S. foreign aid budget should be left alone. It doesn't mean that everything is done perfectly. It doesn't mean that accountability shouldn't be part of the issue. But by and large, we are liked and well respected around the world, and we should do everything we can to maintain that.
Let me just follow up very quickly. I mean, we're returning to the norm, let me start with that. And we're not in the norm anymore. You know, we're in the middle of a truly unprecedented crisis. And I think, you know, the Obama administration made food security a really signature issue with Feed the Future. Is it as simple as just sort of restoring past approaches, or does this moment call for something different that you would sort of suggest that the Biden administration might consider?
Well, I think our two other guests, Tjada and Clarence, would offer because they're involved on the ground efforts and policy efforts even more than I am. But it's never going to be the same. Change is taking place all over the world. Communications technologies reflect change. Changing world power arrangements reflect change. Research changes. For example, what you eat, how you should eat, the role of food security, all those kinds of things. So it's not going to be identical. It will never be identical, but it does need to reflect the fact that we do. I'm kind of from the view that we have a special place in the world to assist the world. It's in our best interest to do that economically, politically, and militarily, but it's also the right thing to do. And I realize it's tough when we have these terrible budget problems. COVID is a disaster in the United States as well as in the rest of the world. You know, a lot of people are worried, well, how can we go out and deal with the rest of the world when we've lost almost 300,000 people that have died in the US because of COVID. But at the same time, it doesn't take away from America's leadership. And you just go back into history. I'm just finishing this book on Harry Truman and how he used a former president, Herbert Hoover, to rebuild Europe after the Second World War with the Marshall Plan, and what a difference that made for peace and stability around the world.
That's a big call to action. And I think you've identified something critical, which is that we're in a moment of enormous competing priorities. And Clarence, let me jump to you on that. You know, next week marks the 5th anniversary of the Paris Climate Agreement, which President-elect Joe Biden has pledged to rejoin. How do you see the incoming administration working to align development and climate priorities so that they're not in tension with one another, drawing from, you know, the same sort of pool of resources and energy? How do we sort of build alignment around some of these really huge and critical and urgent priorities?
It's going to be a significant challenge, Michael, and I spent working with the Australian government over the past few years or so and watching this from outside of the Washington policy arena, more or less. I've struggled with how do you align climate and development, but I think that there are some interesting areas. But let me go back and say I totally agree with Secretary Glickman that there is no normal that we're going back to. We're in a new era and it's never going to be like it was, but that's also an opportunity. It just like during President Truman's time, the post-war era, we have to have a mindset like that. We need to start thinking about how we build a world, a society and a world for the 21st century. Getting back to your question specifically, you know, U.S. leadership is really important on a global stage, and rejoining Paris is something that I definitely applaud, and my colleagues at FCNL applaud. But the world isn't going to just sit back and welcome us with open arms. It's time to put our actions and money where our leadership is. So we will need, as the United States, a serious and significant nationally determined contribution, which is part of a linchpin of the Paris Agreement, where we assess our domestic opportunities and goals and communicate those targets. So we need a robust U.S. national determined contribution as a signal of our seriousness on the global stage. Secondly, I hope to see the administration deliver on the $2 billion that's outstanding from the U.S. government's 2014 pledge to the Green Climate Fund, which is very important. And finally, I expect that you'll see climate, you know, the incoming administration has said that climate is going to be mainstream, and this is not just the EPA, but it's going to be a whole of government approach. So I expect a real focus on stopping fossil fuel financing by the U.S. Development Finance Corporation and Ex-Im Bank, and a real focus on using particularly the DFC as a way to help financing for low and middle income countries who are looking for climate solutions. And this all ties into also with something Secretary Glickman said in terms of China. We have this strategic competition that is going on with China that is really a bipartisan sort of outlook now, I think, in the US. And I think we're going to have to partner with the Chinese. I hope that we partner with the Chinese to address climate issues. But we have to offer something for countries that see the appeal of Chinese foreign assistance or the Belt and Road Initiative, and they're choosing projects that are not fossil fuel, that are basically based on fossil fuels. We have to give those countries an alternative to the investments that come along with the Belt and Road Initiative, just as one example. So I expect the US foreign assistance to really line up strongly in the US response to climate change. But as I said, we have to demonstrate our bona fides again to the global community in a solid way, not just with pronouncements.
I think it's a great point, and that's something that you do hear out of the Biden team, is this intention to draw connections between international and domestic policy in ways that, you know, we might not have seen for a long time. On the point about sort of, you know, climate change versus development, or climate change and development, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on sort of what that means for the development community, and whether you anticipate that, you know, there will continue to be a development community and a climate community, or whether those two things might come together, and what that might mean in sort of the foreign aid structure. I'll give you a minute to think about that, but let me jump to Tjada, because I have a sort of similar operational question for you, Tjada. I mean, you've worked in the development field for a long time. If the next White House places a greater emphasis on global development as a strategic priority, what do you think that will mean for development organizations and professionals? Do you expect they will be asked to work differently, or to think differently about their roles within US foreign policy? What are some of the sort of operational considerations here?
Yeah, nothing's the same anymore. And even, you know, COVID has changed the way that a lot of us work. The other factor that kind of started in the US, but that has really tremored throughout the world, that's changed things, especially for international NGOs, is the recognition that we have not been as diverse or inclusive or equitable as we should have been. And a lot of that comes from our colonialist roots, a lot of us. So, you know, in terms of how we work, some of the things that we are increasingly moving towards, and that we think we will absolutely need to continue to do, are to improve our efforts towards localization. And that does not just mean spinning off into, you know, for it to be Mercy Corps Kenya. And it doesn't just mean having, you know, local Kenyan partners that are subs on grants where we are the lead. You know, we really need to think about how we empower local actors, how we share power, how we give up power to them. We're increasingly thinking about how to build capacity, what kind of capacity they can help build in us, and even just how we speak and think differently to be better partners and to be more inclusive, and how we change our own makeup to accomplish those goals, or things that we think we will be pressed to do. It also just goes along with climate change and movements and the way that we are around the world, and really making sure that we have strong localization. I think we will have to continue to understand how to use our voices and leverage and influence. There's a lot happening on the financing space. You know, I think now this new administration will really look at how to expand and really take advantage of the Development Finance Corporation. And we also expect the administration to do more with multilateral development banks like the World Bank and the regional banks. So NGOs are going to have to pivot to learn how to be strong partners to those institutions, to think a little bit about things like results-based financing, I think, and just to continue to be good partners with different sectors, and to bring innovative things to bear in the sector.
And is that because, I mean, on sort of across those considerations, is that because you expect the incoming administration to really make a push on those issues? Will they come in with sort of a fresh energy around aid effectiveness? I mean, what do you see as sort of the mechanism that's going to drive some of those long sought, changes within the development sector?
I think we have a lot of great horsepower coming into the administration and helping us set policy, and a lot of great mental horsepower that was inside that was thinking about these things. So none of them are new, right? Like localization is something, when I served at USAID from 2010 to 2015, I know Administrator Shaw made that push there. I think we still got to small percentages, but I think people increasingly want to see more. I think looking at different finance mechanisms, I think there are ways that people want to see more. I think, frankly, the environment too. I think there are ways that people think they can get more results for the same amount of money. So I think we're going to have to just drive towards greater efficiencies and really proof points. And I think a lot financing and this global push for austerity is going to push that. Even outside of the US, DFID, the UK's development agency, no longer exists as its own development agency, right? It's merged into their foreign office, their State Department. So I think just within the broader context, when the U.S. thinks about the goals that it's going to want to achieve, it's going to push our sector to try to be more efficient and imaginative and collaborative.
Great. And then either Clarence or Secretary Glickman, as we're seeing these sort of crises converge, whether it's climate and the urgency of development goals, like you talked about, Clarence, or COVID and food security, Secretary Glickman, what kind of change or self-reflection do you think is incumbent on the development community to be able to sort of think more broadly and to place their work in the context of all of these competing priorities?
Well, I'll say that I think the development community is going to have to do some reimagining of how it approaches development and what development, not what it means, but how the community goes about doing it. I mean, I think that COVID's a pressure. The economic crisis, particularly in the West, is pressure, and then climate is a pressure. And I speculate that down the road, you're going to see a merger of climate and foreign assistance, like maybe over the next decade or so, because of those pressures. And I think that, there's a need to reimagine what we mean by foreign assistance and development. Tjada said something that really perked my ears, and I've heard a lot of. There's a neo-colonial mindset that international development is framed in, and people notice it now, people in developing countries and people in developed countries. And I don't think that framework it doesn't work any longer. And I see us as, I see the aid community needing to step back and think of how are we going about doing this, and how do we do this in a different way? And I don't profess to know what that means, but I think it's coming down the pike.
So I would just add a couple of specifics. Some of them relate to food and some of them relate to more general agenda. But in the area of food and food security, I think to date there's been an inadequate attention to the issue of nutrition. It's more a question of volume of food rather than what it actually is that people eat. I recall years ago, I participated in a panel on the Council on Foreign Relations, and the discussion was non-communicable diseases in the developing world. These are diseases like cardiovascular disease, cancer, arthritis, and there was no discussion of nutrition. The discussion all related to getting pharmaceuticals into that area and tobacco control. Both of those are very important, but what people eat and what goes into their body has a lot to do with how they thrive. And there's been more attention in terms of, 0 to 3 years old and those kinds of things. But that's one area where I think the development community could do a much better job as it relates to food. It's more than just dealing with famine, which is critical, but it's also dealing with sustenance. The other thing has to do with research. So we've seen from the COVID epidemic that we've lost well over 1 million people worldwide, and it may grow to 2 million people. because of this disease of a virus that jumps from animals to humans. And first we were dealing with what I call the African diseases, Ebola, and the Latin American diseases, Zika. But now we're dealing with diseases of the developed world as well. And we need to, the development community needs to look at the research agendas around the world and try to determine what are the asteroids that could come down and destroy us over the next decade or 2 decades, and globally cooperate on a much more supple research agenda. So let's, the most recent data I've seen shows that 70% of all human viruses come from animals. You know, and that's what's, I think, going to kill us in the future in big numbers. And as we have dealt with this one, science is hopefully producing a vaccine that gets us out of there faster. But this is particularly a problem for the developing world that doesn't have the health infrastructure to deal with the things. And we're having a tough enough time in the United States figuring out how to distribute these vaccines. So this is where I think the development community ought to be working with the private sector and you know, a strong intellectual foundation to look at what are these challenges that are likely to affect us all in the future. Because what happens in the developing world transfers to the developed world and vice versa. There's no artificial demarcation line anymore. That's the, I guess, the main point that I would make.
That's, yeah, I think that's really well put. And Secretary Glickman, let me just ask, adding climate change to that list, when you think about food security, you know, smallholder farmers throughout low and middle income countries, does that require the same sort of rethink that you're describing there in terms of how some of these institutions think about what their work entails?
Well, I think that we're in an evolving area. You know, for example, yields, Tjada would know a lot more about this than I do, but you know, yields in sub-Saharan Africa for row crops are about half what they are in the United States, maybe not even that amount. And of course, heat, drought, excessive rainfall just absolutely wreak havoc on the ability of farmers to cope. And those will accelerate during the period of climate change, particularly in places like sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and some parts of India as well. And it's also going to impact us here in the United States as well. And in fact, no industry is probably more susceptible to the vagaries of climate change and crazy weather patterns than agriculture is. I mean, it's all outdoors. You know, and given the fact that in a lot of these developing countries, half the people at least, many are not, most of them are women, are in agriculture, smallholder agriculture, small scale agriculture. And so climate change is going to impact them rather dramatically. And that's where the research agendas of the world come into play. How can we better get them to increase their yields, use less water, and do a lot of the other techniques? So allowing them to not be hit so hard when a drought hits or a weather hits and that kind of thing.
Michael, may I add to the Secretary's comments there? Because he's absolutely right, of course. The food security and climate are very interrelated, but I think we also have to talk about conflict, because even before COVID, before this administration took over, we were dealing with unprecedented numbers of displaced people around the world because of conflict. And that is only going to get worse with COVID and with climate change, right? Climate change forces increased competition for resources. That's also exacerbated by some of what we're seeing in COVID and post-COVID that we have to address and that we even have here in the US is misinformation and disinformation. And suspicion of other groups for bringing in COVID or thinking that a government is kind of the fraying of the fabric between society and state, wondering if the government's trying to control them or what's going on. So I think, you know, climate change is another thing that just exacerbates conflict. We're in a situation now with COVID where we're just at risk of increasing conflict and displacement. There was one recent study that projected another 13 countries may be ignited in conflict by 2022 because of this. So I think these are thinking about conflict and this expanded definition of resilience and and how you can have people kind of still remain in place or be able to make livelihoods or other things in the midst of this, I think are really important things that will continue.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you for that. So we're running out of time here, and I want to project forward a little bit. If we were to reconvene a year from now to talk about what the Biden administration achieved in global development in 2021, what do you hope your answer would be? I originally thought of this question in terms of 4 years, like their whole legacy, and then I realized that projecting 4 years in the future at the current moment is a completely insane thing to do. So I'm limiting it to 1 year, which granted is a little bit more modest of an agenda. But what's something that you would hope they would achieve in 2021? And Clarence, if you don't mind me putting you on the spot, let's start with you.
I would hope that the Biden administration, the Biden-Harris administration would have achieved by this time next year an agreement to partner with China in particular and with India on some serious low carbon targets globally. That would be great to see. China, the US, and the European Union really taking the lead and setting some real serious low carbon targets and figuring out how to work collaboratively. We can still compete, but you can also collaborate. So I think that setting that global standard would be, I would like to see that. I hope to see that within a year.
Secretary Glickman, what's a successful first year in global development?
Well, first of all, I agree totally with Clarence. I mean, China is besides the United States, China is the other great power in this world. And we got a lot of beefs with the Chinese, but we also have areas we have to work together on, and they're not our enemy, at least not in everything. So I think Clarence's point is really good. The Chinese view on development tends, as I said before, tends to be more transactional. We'll provide you money for here, then we'll use our labor workers and we'll build this. And it often doesn't work very well, but there is an area for collaboration and cooperation. Two is, I think, and just quickly, stability in programming. So we're not up and down. Money doesn't go triple and then 1/3, and there's a stability there so that people can plan, particularly at the agencies like USAID and their partners. And the third thing I say was we're going to be naming ambassadors all over the world, and ambassadors are kind of like the president of the United States in that particular country. So each ambassador really has to view development and as an important part of their job. And sometimes it's difficult to do with other conflicts that are going on, but that way the local areas, the people who live on the ground in developing countries, know that it's important. What the United States is talking about is high priority.
Fantastic. And Tjada, last word to you.
So some of mine might be a little bit more concrete. I hope that when the current amounts for international development in the COVID stimulus bills that have been passed and ones on the table, the amounts for international assistance have been pittances. And I'm hoping that this administration, because it understands the universality of all this, will have increased the amounts in those bills for development assistance, because this is something that impacts all of us. I hope that this administration, I hope what we'll see is they kind of influence G8 and G20 and other multilateral things. I hope to see a forceful development agenda that incorporates climate, that's holistic, involved in all those things. And I'm really excited about some fresh new ideas coming out, and from a posture of development being a good thing, and America first encompassing a robust development agenda. So I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful there are things we can't even foresee that we'll start seeing in the next few months or year.
And if I could just add to Tjada, I mean, it is kind of money in one sense of the word. There's got to be enough resources there. Right now, we're trying to do our best to make sure there's enough money for U.S. Global assistance in either the COVID bill or supplemental bill, and we do desperately need those funds. The second thing is bipartisanship. In the toxic political environment that we have in Washington today, this is an area that has great potential to bring people together. I mean, look at the collaboration that's existed between Senator Coons and Senator Graham on a lot of these issues. And I realize that that's one of many examples. And the president and the Biden administration may be good at leading the effort, but they really do need this collaboration, because the Congress is going to be almost 50-50, both houses, regardless of what happens in Georgia and all these other kinds of things. And I know Tjada can talk about the fact that those heroes, those champions in Congress, bipartisan champions, have made all the difference in the world in terms of appropriations and American support.
And
Fantastic.
I'll just add that the climate doesn't care about your political party.
Very true. Yes. Well, I appreciate that closing thought. It was very optimistic on Secretary Glickman's point, and then Clarence, you went a little bit darker, but that's all right. We'll deal with that. But I do think that is a hopeful outlook. These are inherently bipartisan priorities, or at least they have been for a long time. You've all laid out a very ambitious agenda, one that I think sort of combines a desire or a hope for a return to some stability with some big ambitions and some really bold thinking. So we'll have to wait and see what the next year and the next 4 years bring. But it's been fantastic hearing from each of you. And I really, really appreciate your participation today. Thanks to our audience for joining in. Again, I'm Michael Igoe with Devex, and this has been my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you to Global Washington.
Yes.
Thanks everyone so much, and especially to our speakers and moderator for sharing your expertise with us today. We appreciate you. Coming up next is our closing keynote session. Please return to Whova, click on Agenda in the far left panel, and select the next session to get connected. Thanks so much and enjoy your day.